Understanding Logical Arguments, a guide to philosophical thinking. Now, during the duration of this class, we are going to be taking a look at a number of philosophical arguments and putting together our own philosophical arguments. So what is an argument? Usually when we think of the word argument, we have in mind a heated exchange between two people with probably very charged words and very heated emotions. But in terms of philosophy, this is not what we mean. We will not be bickering with each other. We will not be screaming at each other. We will not be exchanging harsh words with one another. At least I hope not. If that's the sort of argument that you want to have, it might be best to drop this class and maybe take another, like interpersonal communications. So, if that's not the argument that we will be having, what is an argument? Well, an argument is a set of premises that attempt to prove an idea. We are going to try to work as best as we can with logical, rational proofs. All arguments have two components. They have premises and conclusions. So let's take a look at those two components. The premises are a set of ideas leading to a final idea or a conclusion. The conclusion is the idea that you're attempting to prove. Now, I've taken this quote from a Supreme Court case on the Fourth Amendment regarding the search and seizure of, well, your trash. And the question is whether police could search through your garbage without a warrant. And one of the justices put forth this argument. And it has a premise. The set of ideas, or the idea that they hope will support their conclusion, is when persons voluntarily abandon property, they forfeit any expectation of privacy in that they might have had. And the conclusion that they hope this premise supports is, therefore, a warrantless search or seizure of abandoned property is not unreasonable under the Fourth Amendment. Now, we'll be examining this argument, or at least a modified version of it, in more detail, as we put it into standard form. Well, what is standard form? When we put something into standard form, it involves numbering the premises, separating them all out, identifying them individually, and identifying the conclusion. We do this because it helps us examine the argument, and we're going to put the argument that we just looked at, just a modified version of it, into standard form. It helps us examine and understand the argument. It helps us determine whether the argument is sound. And we'll be discussing validity and soundness in just a moment. So, let's take a look at the argument, shall we? If you put your property into a trash can and then set it on the side of the road, you are abandoning your property. When you abandon your property, you forfeit any expectation of personal privacy. If you give up the right to personal privacy, then the discarded items are not protected from search and seizure. Therefore, the police do not need a warrant to search through your trash. As we put this into standard form, let's separate out these premises. The first premise, if you put your property into your trash, you are abandoning your property. The second statement that we hope will prove the conclusion is when you abandon your property, you forfeit personal privacy. The third in this sentence, or in this paragraph, the third sentence that functions as our third premise is if you forfeit property, your abandoned property is not protected from search and seizure. And the fourth idea we hope will support the conclusion is if you are not protected from search and seizure, the police do not need a warrant to search through your garbage. Therefore, and this line often symbolically represents the word therefore, and it is used to signify that we are separating the premises from the conclusion. The conclusion is, therefore, police do not need a warrant to search through your trash. Now, we do this, as we say, to determine the validity and the soundness of the argument, or at least to help us determine the validity. So it raises the question, what is validity and what is soundness? Well, valid arguments are ones that have a proper logical structure. It has a structure that properly connects the premises with the conclusion or conclusions. And validity can be evaluated by the form, the structure, the pattern that the argument follows. Soundness, by contrast, or at least along with validity, a sound argument must be valid. Now, validity and soundness are two different things, but in order for something to be sound, it must be valid. It can be valid without being sound, but it can't be sound without being valid. And sound arguments must have premises that are all true. If it is valid and the premises are true, then it proves that our conclusion is also true. Now, we probably need to expand on this idea of validity. It is usually very difficult for intro students to get their minds around what validity means. So let's take a look at what a valid form is, and we'll contrast it with invalid forms. First, as we've mentioned, valid forms have proper logical connections. They are the groundwork for proper arguments. And in a valid form, if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Invalid forms, by contrast, have an improper logical structure. There is not a logical connection between their premises and their conclusions. They are called formal fallacies, which is separate and distinct from the informal fallacies, which we may have a vidcast on later. And even if all of the premises are true of an invalid form, then the conclusion may be untrue. It might be true, but if it is, it's true kind of by accident. We'll take a look at a few of these valid and invalid forms, and the first valid form that we'll look at is the modus ponens. The modus ponens goes, in its structure, if A, then B, A, therefore B. The A and B here represent variables, and I know that many of you are going to think exactly how much like math can we make thinking, but that is indeed the job of formal logic. The formal logic, we're going to give you some symbols that will represent these ideas just to make it easier to do the comparisons. You will not be responsible on exams for putting things into symbolic form. The symbolic form off to the left, if A, then B. If I have driven another 3,000 miles, then I will need an oil change. The A is I have driven another 3,000 miles. The B is I will need an oil change. I have driven another 3,000 miles. Therefore, I will need an oil change. So we can see how this very simple argument is represented symbolically off to the left, and we know that this is a valid form. We have lists and books full of valid forms and invalid forms. We know this to be a valid form. Contrast this with affirming the consequent. If A, then B. B, therefore A. And if you take a look at the previous section of the screen, and we'll put these side by side later, you'll notice that the A's and B's are switched on the second and third lines here. This is an invalid form. The example, if I am typing my paper, my computer is on. My computer is on. Therefore, I am typing my paper. Now, we know this to be invalid because all the premises can be true, but the conclusion may be untrue. I'm on my computer questing on World of Warcraft. I might be on my computer flipping through YouTube. I might be clicking through Imager. The computer is on, but you're not. So, here we have these two contrasted side by side, and you can see that though the first line is the same, if A, then B, switching the A and the B in the second and third lines changes it from an invalid form to a valid form, or vice versa. The modus ponens being the valid form, the affirming the consequent being an invalid form. We'll do another example. The next valid form that we're going to look at is the modus tollens. If A, then B. Not B, therefore not A. If my sister wins the tournament, she will bring home a trophy. She did not bring home a trophy. Therefore, my sister did not win the tournament. Now, some of you may look at this and say, well, this doesn't seem like it is necessarily true. What if, for some reason, her trophy had gotten broken, or lost, or they didn't have enough trophies? Well, then you would be attacking the first premise, saying that the first premise is untrue. But that is really kind of irrelevant when we're taking a look at just the form for the moment. We're exploring the validity thus far. We're not looking at the soundness just yet. So even if that first premise is false, the form, the structure of the argument is true. We'll have to first determine if it's valid, and then we'll take a look at the soundness. So, if A, then B, B, or not B, therefore not A, is a valid form. If all of these premises are true, if it is true that my sister wins the tournament, she will bring home a trophy, then this argument is going to be true. We'll contrast that with denying the antecedent. If A, then B, not A, therefore not B. Represented symbolically, so we can easily see the structure. In the example, if I am working on a paper, my computer is on. I am not working on a paper, therefore my computer is not on. Well, we can look at that and see immediately that there is something wrong. Even if these premises are true, the conclusion might still be false. I might have stepped away from working on a paper and turned on Pandora while I do dishes in the next room so I can listen to music. Or the computer might be on while I'm blowing off my paper, questing in Worlds of Warcraft. Now we can see these two set up side by side. If A, then B, then the difference between the not B and the not A makes all the difference in terms of the valid modus ponens and the invalid, denying the antecedent. Now that we've compared and contrasted the valid and invalid forms, and just so you know, there are several more that we will not be covering, we will now introduce sound arguments. If the argument's form is valid, we can check the premises. If all the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Congratulations. It is true, however, whether we like it or not. There are sometimes we will see the conclusion of an argument and we do not like what that conclusion says, and so we're tempted to just write off the whole thing, to say, I don't like what that says, so I don't have to listen to it. Well, that's not really the way that logic works. If the premises are true and the conclusion is true, we are forced to accept the conclusion. If you don't like what that conclusion says, you've got to try to disprove the argument. And you can disprove the argument by showing that one of the premises is flawed, or that the structure is invalid. That's the way that logic works. If you don't want to listen to the rules of logic, then it might be best to go try some sort of other class. Now, there is another way to discuss arguments in terms of the informal fallacies. However, we will not be discussing the informal fallacies at this time. That might be the subject of another podcast sometime in the future.